So we wanted to bring some of that event down here to Utah Valley University and invite some of our best students and faculty members to come and participate in a discussion on Mormon women, history as a guide, as a compass to the future, I think is the title we gave it. So we have three panelists, and Blair's going to introduce those. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Brian Birch, who probably wants to welcome us.
As Boyd said, I'm Brian Birch. I'm a longtime faculty member here at UVU in the Religious Studies program, and have worked with Boyd and Blair and others on developing Mormon studies here, and it's just been a delight to work with them and to see this program grow and develop, and we're just thrilled to have the presenters at the conference come down and share a little of their time with us. So thank you very much for your time and effort.
Well, this certainly is an enjoyable format, a little more casual, laid back, and intimate. And so to our presenters, the students that are here today are some of the finest and sharpest, and so we're thrilled to have them. Coming over, I was asked if Richard Bushman was going to be here, and I said, well, Claudia Bushman's husband will be here. I've heard it may be Richard Bushman. Women in Mormonism, Claudia Bushman is going to be here today. And so, introduction-wise, Claudia, of course, is a Latter-day Saint and historian, professor at Columbia for many years. She's the mother of 6 children and was recognized as the Mother of the Year in the state of New York in 2000.
2002.
2002? Mm-hmm. Or both 2000 and 2002?
Just 2002, only once.
Those of us who are acquainted with Claudia would not be surprised if it was 2000 and 2002. Anyway, she's the author of several historical works and many academic articles treating Latter-day Saint history, Mormon culture, Latter-day Saint women, culture in the inner city of New York, some broad scope of work that Claudia Bushman is involved in. Our second panelist today is Dr. Susanna Morell. And Susanna teaches courses in the United States religious history. She received her doctorate in the history of religions from the University of Chicago. She's a careful student of American religion and how religion fits in the landscape of the American experiment, and specifically in how women fit into that landscape. And so, Susanna, welcome. Our third presenter is Lisa Olson-Tate, who is teaching currently in the Church History and Doctrine Department, among other things, at BYU. She received her PhD in American Literature with her certificate in Women's Studies from the University of Houston, and her focus is on late 19th century Mormon history and Mormon women's history. She's the mother of 4 children, and so as a mother, a professor, a wife, and a Latter-day Saint in the postmodern era, Lisa has a fascinating arena to work in as a researcher. And so if you will join with me in welcoming our presenters, and then we'll turn the time to Claudia, please. Thank you.
And I look for this as a place to do experimental and interesting things that sometimes don't happen. at that other campus. When I asked Boyd what I was to talk about on this occasion, he's left it entirely up to me, but he said that what he would like is one part Mormon sisters and one part Should Mormon Women Speak Out, which are the titles of other things I've done in the past. And what I got from that was that there should be some appreciation about our noble women of the past and present, and some outrageous comments. Great. That's the kind of talk I like to give. However, I have to say, I'm not up to my outrageous best today. This will be a fairly milquetoast presentation, but sometimes I can really do that. My major passion for the last 4 years has been an oral history project, which we began in 2009 at Claremont Graduate University, where we were teaching, Richard and I. Seeing a lack of documents and materials about contemporary LDS women, we have been recording their voices, trying to get down what they have to say. The voices of women are underrepresented in the written materials of the church, I think we all know. LDS women still live in a patriarchal society. What is it like for them? How do they respond to the church they have joined or inherited? Can they make space for their interests? How do they envision their contemporary role in the church? What are the issues that define their lives? How do they experience the church and family relations? How have Mormon principles shaped their lives? What is the basis of their faith and loyalty? Well, where have they rebelled and thought for themselves? To what extent do they speak out? The Claremont Mormon Women Oral History Project in the 20th and 21st centuries was organized to help address some of these questions. The program is in response to a grant that we received from the Singer Foundation to do something for women. It wasn't a very big grant. I think we got $10,000, but when you get some money, what are you to do with it? And so we discussed this for some time and finally settled on doing an oral history because we considered that it would be beneficial for the students who had learned to manage a new program. It would be useful for the women who were interviewed because they would have written accounts of their lives for themselves and for their families. And it would be very useful for the scholars to have these first-hand voices of women which they could use for now and into the future. And the program has proved valuable to all of those groups so far, as well as to other Mormons and members of the general public who have listened to and applauded the presentations and the papers of the students involved. Already, I think, even due to this little project, the voices of Mormon women have been amplified. Some of our students and other town people that we drafted have used the interviews to write essays that have been gathered in a manuscript, which we are submitting to Greg Coford Books for publication. Actually, it's already been submitted. It's been approved. I mean, it's going to happen, but we're going to try and submit the final manuscript this month. It was to be this month. It'll probably be next month. You know how these things go. But our people have been working over the interviews thematically and comparatively, interpreting and making sense out of them. And sometime in 2013, this book should be available, and you will have the chance to sample some of these interviews and see what women actually have to say. These interviews, this project, is our gift to the future, also to the people that we interviewed and their families, but it's primarily a gift to the future. You just think what this means. All these signed and dated statements from real people. We've got them. It's wonderful. Now, these loose interviews do not prove anything about the women of our time. We have just gotten down what they have to say, their biographical information, their responses to general questions about current Mormon women's issues and experience. We certainly use these things for our own purposes now, but scholars will have access to them for ages to come. While written accounts of Mormon women's lives have been encouraged and valued for the almost 200 years of the Church's history, those from eminent women have been privileged, which I think we know, and there's reason to do that. The stories of female leaders and the wives of male leaders, along with faith-promoting accounts of pioneer heroism, have been used to teach faith and to inspire religious principles in the rising generation. Recently, the stories of some of the LDS dissidents, interesting dissidents, have been recorded to document the movements they've been involved in. And any project that will forefront women and their lives and their interests, I very highly sponsor and endorse. But we, in this project, don't buy the idea that some people are more important than other people. We want them all. Those interviewed for the purpose, we call them our narrators, are chosen not quite by random, but the group grows outward from the original student nucleus in all directions. Some women are chosen by the interviewers. Some people are chosen by committees, some because they belong to special groups, some wanting to tell their stories, volunteer. Some write and submit their own stories. I wrote my own. I didn't think there was any point in my being interviewed and then writing it out, so I just wrote it myself. And it took me about a month, writing about a page a day, to get out what I had to say for the purposes of this project. No one knows all these women. No one. In choosing our narrators, our only requirements have been their femaleness, a significant connection to the Mormon Church, and a willingness to tell their stories. They do not need to be of any particular age, activity in the church, marital condition, or ethnic group. They range from their teens to their 90s, with widely differing educational achievement, marital status, number of children, faithfulness. We have in our collection beauty queens, CEOs, converts, Relief Society presidents, inactives, bishops' wives, dropouts, PhDs, people on welfare. We have women returned from church missions, divorcees, temple workers, and excommunicants. I think we have people in most groups you could come up. We have a fundamentalist. I'm not sure we have a Native American. Better work on that. But none of these people really represent whatever groups they're in. They're all individuals, but I'm just trying to show you the range of what we've got. Our project aims to record the experiences of LDS women in their homes and family life, their church life, their work life, and their roles as homemakers, students, missionaries, career women, single women, converts, disaffected members, etc. We have many frank voices. These signed and dated statements, again, a rich source at the moment of their creation, will increase in value over time. I think they are pure gold. We have a single page of general questions which our narrators see in advance. And this is it, and I'm going to pass it around so you can see what we ask. It's very general, does not try and push anybody in any direction. Say whatever you want to it. They see it in advance. We've revised it about 1,000 times. This is one revision, but the rule is always it can be no more than 1 page long. So everything is on this page. And that doesn't mean everything we get is on this page. It means these are the things we ask. So I'll just pass that around and you can see it. We record stories as people wish to tell them. If the narrator has nothing to say about some subject, that's fine. If she's able to do a monologue, we're willing to record that. And she also has the chance to change anything she wants to down the line. Often the interviewers cannot resist joining in conversation. When something wonderful is said, say, oh, well, when you want to say. But this is not a conversation. This is the narrator's story. And if they offer to talk about other subjects, that's great. We like episodes, stories, attitudes, anecdotes, experiences. Facts are okay. We'll take facts too, but we like things that have some kind of shape to them. They are able to take out anything that on second thought they wish they hadn't said. They can add, they can rearrange, they can expand down the line. They have the final say. Now, transcribers edit these recordings a little bit as they type. They take out repetitions, grammatical errors, false starts, whatever else they find, because narrators do not really want to hear exactly what they said. It comes out a lot rawer than they think it was. So we clean it up a little bit. All questions and all interviewer comments are edited out. We try to provide clean versions of what the narrators said for them to look over. This is a big job. It's a very big job. The reviewed and finalized documents are numbered and added to the collection. We had an event on May 1st, 2010. That was our oral history tea. And at that point, the project had completed 53 interviews toward our projected goal of 100. Then we had a conference on February 5th in 2011, Women's Lives, Women's Voices, Agency in the Lives of Mormon Women. And at that time, we had completed 117 interviews. We now have about 160 completed interviews, and the new goal is to reach 200 and to include many women from the global church. This project was begun in Southern California, soon expanded to the western states, then to the whole United States, and we now have voices from 10 foreign countries, and we hope to have many more from the global church down the line. Translations really complicate this process, but we soldier on. The stories of these women, marked by subtlety and nuance, defy the stereotypes. Many of these narrators would ordinarily be silent. They do not speak out. They do not value their own stories. This project preserves and perpetuates their voices and memories. The silent majority speaks. And we have recently deposited the transcribed interviews with the Library of the Claremont Colleges, but they are not yet open to the public. So they are recorded, transcribed, corrected, and now all these have been digitized. So they're in very good shape. Just what do our people have to work with? They have long statements, most between 15 and 35 single-spaced pages, of what those women had to say at that particular moment on many different topics. This is an open-ended effort, a net to catch whatever topic was thrown out in the hope that there'll be an abundance of valuable and interesting material. We do not aim to prove anything. Everything is suggestive. We work with an extensive sample of mostly oral communication in written form in which we show a range of response on a number of issues. And this book that we're working on represents experience transferred into language through the limited views of many narrators. Our records and our minds are filled with prejudices, preferences, and opinions. All unaware, we write and speak these things. We make no claim to get down the simple and impossibly elusive truth. Still, no one else can tell our stories better than we can, with all their faults. Every writer writes with preconceived ideas, limited knowledge, with deep immersion in her own culture, and we have to go with what we have in our minds, always knowing that our view is clouded. Each time we speak, we make 1,000 conscious and unconscious decisions that reveal our affections and our prejudices. What we say is a representation of what is in our minds, not the truth. Yet, with all our limitations, once more, our stories can illuminate our worlds for others. We have to get these down. If we want to live forever in the minds and annals of the earth, we have to leave a record. Language is clumsy and inaccurate, but language is all we have. Our essayists in this book have chosen topics central to the Latter-day Saint experience, and then through the application of their own diverse sensibilities, explored a number of accounts to see what those interviewed people have said. Writers have been told to give context to the quotations from the collection, and they've chosen various contexts. In our book, we see narrators through the organizing lenses of history, LDS church doctrine, mythology, feminist theory, personal experience, the work of other historians, and even through current events. Each topic could be viewed through other lenses. Each writer could have chosen from dozens of other topics. We see our collection as an inexhaustible source of illumination. What are the dangers in this kind of information gathering? Oral historians have been criticized for taking advantage of their subjects because the relationship between them is unequal, the interviewer stealing the narrator's story for her own purposes. We've tried to make this a more equal partnership by making the primary end of the project to preserve the voices of the narrators rather than the conclusions of the scholars writing about them. Scholarship resulting from the study of the interviews is secondary to this preservation. The project is also made more equal by including the narrators and their relatives as narrators, including the interviewers and their relatives as narrators. Many narrators have gone on to interview others. We're all in this together. We consider it a privilege rather than an exploitation to be part of the program. Narrators signed forms giving us permission to use the interviews and to use their names, but because of the sensitive nature of some of the material, we've chosen not to use names for now. We refer to our interviews by number and edit quotations to avoid identification. Eventually, when the documents are placed in repositories and open to the public, the names will be there. For now, we use pseudonyms. I'm really very proud of this project that we have in hand. 2,500 pages, 2,500 single-space pages. And did I say they were signed and dated? By contemporary LDS women. I think it's a treasure. One positive development of the project is that the current dean of Claremont Graduate University's School of Arts, Humanities, and Religion, Tammy Schneider, is extending the program beyond Mormonism. In the fall of 2012, the school will begin to interview and record the stories of Jewish and Muslim women. The next year, they will add Catholic and Protestant women. In the ongoing activity, women of many faiths will be invited to participate in recording their stories. Okay, I've given you too much description. What you really want is information from the collection. I'll give you some quickly. What can be found in these documents? Everything. And everyone looking at them would find different things. For myself, I find more individual thinking and less conformity than I would expect. People speak frankly. They don't say what they do in Sunday school class. They know the road answers, but they say other things. I see lots of doctrinal creation as people make sense out of their traditional beliefs and their own experiences. I see lots of free agency, dependence on divine sources, bypassing marital and structural authority. I see defiantly strong women who have overcome early guilt, lots of pain, lots of triumph, many specific answers to many contemporary questions by women who have been there. I can't stop without giving you just a couple of snippets from the interviews, and so I'm going to read you quickly two. I went to BYU the first year, and I had what I love to call my disaster dates. One of the first dates was with a young man who said, as soon as we got in the car, that he needed to ask me some questions. I said, okay. He asked if I were a full tithe payer. I told him that was none of his business. He said he needed to determine before our relationship continued how good a member of the church I was. I still refused to answer. He said that he knew that girls just came to BYU to get married, that I wasn't there to seriously pursue my studies. I immediately told him to turn the car around. We were not going anywhere, and this relationship was not going any further. Take me home now. I was so angry that he would dare say that to me. And of course, that made me sure I wanted to finish my education and be a teacher. All right, here's another one, quite different, and as I say, millions of these. My mom pretty much kicked me out when I was 14 because I was a mess. We got into a big old fight. She escalated it on purpose to get it physical and called the police on me. And they kicked me out to go live with my stepdad for a month until my dad took me in. When I moved in with my dad, I went to another high school. There was another sexual abuse when I was in high school because I was promiscuous and stupid and naive. I'd find myself in situations that were not appropriate. I never finished high school. I did adult school a couple of times. I lived with my real dad a couple of times. I was a runaway for a year, all in the 4 years I should have been in high school. So, what do I think? I think UVU should begin such a program. Offer a class on oral history. Everyone could write her own story, and we have men that write women's stories too, and interview one or two others. If every person here wrote their own story, interviewed their mother, grandmother, their sisters, their daughters if they had any, just think what a treasure trove we would have. The kinds of comparative family studies we could do with just that wonderful sample. Think of the future. What could we do that would be more valuable? We'll never be sorry for working on recording the present for the future. It is endlessly fascinating. It is something that can only be done now. If you do this, you will be glad you did. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. This is actually my first time at UVU, so I'm looking forward to, I've been enjoying so far, and I'm looking forward to continue to learn about it and get to know you all. Looking forward to the discussion afterwards, the formal and the informal part. I think it'll be great. I think we'll have we already have some great topics to get into, so I'm really looking forward to that. So today, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about depictions of LDS women in the media today, and I'm going to try to contextualize it a little bit with how in the past LDS women have been depicted. And this is, I'll say right up front, this is a very kind of anecdotal, preliminary, impressionistic, in a lot of ways, thoughts on my part. So I really welcome you guys to add your own thoughts that might challenge what I have to say, that might add to what I have to say, that might even support what I have to say. So that is what I will focus on today. So with the success of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, this last year or so has been dubbed the Mormon moment. And you guys, I know, have heard that term, I think. This is actually the latest of a number of cyclically returning Mormon moments since the founding of the church in 1830, as, among others, Matt Bowman has observed in a History News Network blog that he wrote. In most previous Mormon moments, for instance, the 1870s, 1880s focus on the government's anti-polygamy campaign, and then right in the 1970s focus on the church's anti-ERA stance. Those are the two moments I'm really going to focus on. In both of those moments, and in other moments as well, the media, and here I'm focusing on newspapers and journals in particular. The media has been interested in focusing on Mormon women in each of these moments. They are sort of a central point of discussion in each of these topics. As I'll talk about, these earlier depictions are complicated, but in general, the media has presented LDS women as victims of an authoritarian religious leadership, and you guys have probably seen this on your own in your classes. So when I learned that I'd be taking part in this seminar, and that its theme would be women and Mormonism in the postmodern world, I decided to use it as an opportunity to assess the way women are being depicted in this present Mormon moment, and to think about how these depictions have changed or stayed the same, and to have us as a group reflect on what this might mean for LDS women and men in the future, especially in terms of how they see themselves in their religious community and in relationship to the wider American culture. So to get a bit more focused in my remarks, what I did was, and again, this is very unscientific, but this is what I did. I searched the topic of Mormon women in the New York Times archives. This is an archive that goes back to 1851. And I looked at about the first 20 articles that came up in my search. And I also added to this some articles that were in other publications that had gotten a lot of press. So there was a Bloomsburg Business Week, How Mormons Make Money. There's a New Yorker article called I Nephi. There are some articles in the Washington Post series on Mitt Romney's faith, among others. You guys probably know other articles. I was just talking to Lisa actually before we started talking, and she mentioned that on NBC last night there was a topic focused on Mormonism, an hour focused on Mormonism, I guess, which I did not see. But if other folks have seen that and want to bring that into the discussion, please do. And if you have other kind of media resources that you want to bring in, do that as well. Again, I was just talking to Lisa that I think nowadays the visual and the television and the internet stuff is in some ways really prevalent and really powerful. So please bring that in. Okay, so briefly what I found was that in previous Mormon moments, the media struggled to reconcile our model of, of Mormon women as downtrodden victims with some of the actions of Mormon women which indicated that these women enjoyed being members of the LDS Church and had a measure of authority within the LDS community. I also found that this present Mormon moment is unusual because the media really is not focused on LDS women in the way that they were in the past. So the first 20 articles that popped up, actually only 2 were from within the last year or so. The rest of the articles were from this 1870s, 1880s period, the 1904 period with the Reed-Smoot hearings, and then the 1970s. And a couple scattered in between, like from 1940, 1895. So there wasn't much focus on women. But when there was, in the present day articles, authors tended to depict LDS women in a fairly positive manner. So as Adam Gopnik notes in his New Yorker article, the media has moved from depicting Mormons as honest to innocent. And this definitely seems to be true in the case of their depictions of Mormon women. I would just add that from what I found, the LDS Church as an institution didn't get such positive press. Individual LDS members were depicted fairly positively. So first, let's take a brief look at the 1870s, 1880s depictions of Mormon women. In this era, Mormon women are usually depicted as victims of a fraudulent religious system, even as the articles report that these women did things like vote and put together pro-polygamy petitions. An August 13, 1871 article from the New York Times, for instance, suggests that Brigham Young's hold on women had been broken and that women soon would be abandoning the practice of polygamy en masse, thus effectively bringing it to an end. So I've got a couple quotes that hopefully will spark some thoughts here. Quote, "So long as Brigham Young can hold the women in subjection by the terrors of excommunication and anathemas, he and his institution of quote-unquote plural wives were safe enough. But now that the fair sex are throwing off his yoke and asserting their rights, the days of polygamy are probably numbered," unquote. 15 years later, we have a March 8, 1886 article in the New York Times, which is less sympathetic to LDS women, perhaps because the abandonment of polygamy en masse did not happen. I don't know. The title is "Mormon Women Protest, Polygamous Wives Who Are Content in Their Slavery." And that sort of tells you everything. It reports that the contents of pro-polygamy speeches, it reports the contents of pro-polygamy speeches at a protest organized by Mormon women. So here's the quote. Quote, "The protest declared that womanhood had been outraged in Utah courts by questions about expected maternity, the fathers of children, etc. Suffrage was declared to be a vested right of women and should not be attacked. An emphatic denial was made that they voted otherwise than according to their free will," unquote. So these are Mormon women who are protesting anti-polygamy actions. What I would throw out here is that's important, I think, to notice in both of these articles is that in both cases, the anti-polygamy argument, the author there, and then these women who are protesting, that they're basing their arguments on what I would call a kind of Victorian separate spheres assumptions about the centrality of women in creating a moral home and thus a moral society. So they're calling on, I think, really deeply embedded notions of gender in order to argue against polygamy and then for polygamy. So not surprisingly, depictions of Mormon women were set within a web of assumptions that were already existing in the public discourse. I'd suggest further, I'd be even more specific in terms of the anti-polygamy article and say that the author there is using gender assumptions in conjunction with long-standing, what I would call, and you guys may come up with a better name for this, what I would call an anti-Catholic argument template that existed in the wider public discourse and had existed, you could argue, you know, since the Puritans landed in the U.S. So, in other words, in U.S. public discourse generated by the media in the 19th century, there were well-recognized and effective anti-Catholic arguments that people would tap into reportedly, and this is part of it. An authoritarian hierarchical institution was undermining U.S. society by attacking the solidity of the moral U.S. family by undermining the moral status and integrity of women, right? That was a major focus of anti-Catholic literature. These were familiar and comfortable arguments for authors and readers. They had heard them over and over again in anti-Catholic literature, such as the widely popular and also fictional story of Maria Monk. I don't know, are you guys familiar with the Maria Monk tale? We can talk about that later. So these authors kind of activated these anti-Catholic templates. That's my thought here, and used them to argue against Mormonism in general, polygamy in particular. Okay, so that's the 1870s, 1880s context. So let's fast forward about 100 years to the 1970s, and the Mormon moment that was generated by the anti-ERA stance of the church, as well as the grassroots level work of church members, both for and against the amendment. Here again, I see echoes of this anti-Catholic template in the public discourse. For instance, a July 25th, 1977 New York Times article describes how 12,000 women from the Relief Society showed up at the Utah meeting of the International Women's Year organization. The article reports that these women voted in overwhelming numbers to reject resolutions that supported the ERA, as well as a number of other women's rights proposals that were put forward at the conference. The author is at pains to argue that this grassroots political activity was actually directed by church officials. So here's the quote from this article. Quote, Mr. Lefevre, who's a spokesman for the LDS Church, said that church officials provided them with quote-unquote informational material on the mechanics of registration and copies of the church's position opposing the Equal Rights Amendment, abortion, and other issues, quote, in case they had any questions, unquote, and then unquote again. As before, in the 1870s and 1880s, the author plays on fears that an authoritarian religious group is using its absolute control over members to attack democratic practices. And here again, I think what's really interesting that it focuses on women members in particular, as though they're somehow more vulnerable or more liable to be manipulated, perhaps. A New York Times article published on May 5th, 1978 explores in a more nuanced way the seemingly contradictory experiences of women in the church. Judy Clemensrud interviews then Relief Society President Barbara B. Smith, who insists that the church supports women's rights and equality, but the leaders feel that it is not necessary for these rights to be protected by a special amendment. Smith herself becomes the embodiment of the contradiction in the author's description of here. And so here's the quote from this article. The 56-year-old Mrs. Smith, who lives in Salt Lake City, looks like a Hollywood version of the glamorous grandmother. Her silvery hair was worn in bouffant style, and her stylish vested blue-gray suit gave her a crisp, no-nonsense look that somehow didn't jibe with her soft-spoken, homespun manner, unquote. There's actually a great picture of her with her great 1970s bouffant and sort of wide-collared suit. The author backs away from explaining this contradiction, simply leaving it stand. Mormon women are expected to fill traditional gender roles, but the church also allows a woman like Smith to run the Relief Society, an organization that at the time reportedly had 1.5 million members, something Smith is able to do, the author notes, because her daughter and her husband help her out with her household tasks. Okay, so that's a tidbit from the 1970s. Let's take a look in the present, really briefly. In the present-day Mormon moment, women and women's issues, as I said, take a back burner in the media coverage of Mormonism. And this, you guys may have theories about this. My thought is this may partly stem from the fact that the moment is largely generated by a male member's presidential bid. I think also the church's stand on homosexuality has gotten a lot of media press lately. And maybe even the popularity of the Book of Mormon musical. Seems kind of silly, but I think that may be part of it. So I did find a January 7th, 2011 article in the New York Times by Nicole Hardy. This was entitled Single Female Mormon Alone. And this talks about how Hardy felt she had no place in the LDS Church as a single woman with no children. So it was a critical article. She makes a moving visit to Planned Parenthood to get birth control, and this catalyzes the process of leaving the church that had been going on for her for a while, actually. She chooses to leave, and this seems to be an interesting shift that has occurred in depictions of LDS women in the media. Authors emphasize that women are expected to live in traditional family roles, but they choose this life, and they make it work for themselves. And if it doesn't work for them, then they leave the church. This shows up in a January 24th, 2012 New York Times article about Mormon food. I don't know if it was sort of got front page in the New York Times. I don't know if you guys read that, but it was a fun article. The author notes that LDS women are expected to fulfill traditional gender roles within the family, even if they go on to graduate school and careers, and that these roles are highly prized within the community and fulfilling for women. So here's the quote from this article. Food was rarely plentiful in the early years. Families were large, and all households tithed at least 10% to the church. So women were strongly encouraged to develop cooking and budget management skills. Being industrious and hardworking is highly prized in Mormon culture. The beehive is a symbol of the church. And for women, cooking provides a real sense of identity and daily purpose, unquote. What I found really interesting about this particular article was the way they were using history in history of Mormon women very differently than the 1970 articles, right? So in this article, it's saying, well, this is why Mormon women are in traditional roles and enjoy them and they're fulfilling, whereas the 1970s article, there was a focus on history, but the focus was women in the church used to be able to run the Relief Society, used to have much more independence. They no longer now, right? So it's interesting that I think it's using, both articles are using history in different ways to talk about Mormon women and sort of depictions of Mormon women. Okay, so the author suggests that LDS women are creatively trying to find ways to make these roles fulfilling in the modern world. So for instance, the article highlights women accomplished in cooking and homemaking arts who become respected bloggers and spread their knowledge to others, become sort of grassroots level experts who have wide networks of folks who are listening to them. This actually reminded me of an article in last week's Salt Lake Tribune about how women are creatively finding roles and fulfillment in the institutional church as an alternative to pushing for being able to hold the priesthood. So again, the focus was on what women are doing to make their lives in the church meaningful to themselves. So just to sort of finish up on this present day depictions, the 1970s Mormon moment media depictions of women comes up again in today's media in an article by Neil J. Young that warns that the group Mormons Building Bridges may clash with the church, as did Sonia Johnson and other members of Mormons for ERA who became targets of church discipline in the 1970s and the 1980s. As I came across this, I wondered if therefore, the issue of homosexuality has actually taken up the space in media discourse that was before reserved for Mormon women. Right now, we're focusing on something different. This has sort of become what the media really wants to key in on. I also wondered if the anti-Catholic template that I talked about of the oppressed, victimized woman has been transferred to polygamous splinter groups like the FLDS. I wonder if the implicit comparison in the media between the media image of FLDS women and the more obviously mainstream lifestyles of LDS women have actually been a boon to LDS women in terms of how the media interprets and depicts them to wider culture. So suddenly for the media, LDS women don't look so oppressed compared to FLDS women. So those are some theories that you guys can agree with or disagree with, add to your thoughts on. I've speculated that the popularity of the Twilight series signals, better than the Romney presidential nomination, that Mormonism has reached a new level of integration with non-Mormon U.S. culture. To me, that series is very Mormon, and yet has become, as you guys know, a runaway success, a phenomenon. I wonder if these shifts in how the media depicts LDS women also indicates this integration, or sort of coming together. The media is less interested in separating Mormonism from the rest of U.S. religions by invoking the primal anti-Catholic template of the oppressed woman and American family victimized by an authoritarian hierarchy. And I guess I would just say here that I really do think in this culture, in the public discourse, and I don't know if we can talk about a kind of American public consciousness or an American kind of cultural religion, that gender is really important, and that there is this really deeply held assumption that women are sort of the stabilizing forces in culture, right? They're the sort of moral stabilizing forces. That's just something that we grow up with, that we assume cross religions, cross time. And so that when the media wants to critique a particular group, whether it be religious, ethnic, whatever, they go to gender, right? They go to how this group treats women, how women exist within the communities. I mean, right? I think this is going on with Islam today. We're looking at the oppression of Muslim women. So I think this is just something that the media keys in on and has repeatedly throughout U.S. history. That's my theory, anyhow. I wonder if, as Will Herberg suggested for Catholic and Jews in U.S. culture in the 1950s, you can now be a good American and a good Mormon, at least in the imagined realm of the U.S. media discourse of the country, which is, as I would emphasize, you guys all know, an imagined realm. In his article, Gopnik places Mormonism in the context of other U.S. religious groups that nurture strong boundaries between insiders and outsiders. This is his quote. These stories of attachment and repulsion are being played out in or around Hasidic communities in Brooklyn every day, and surely, for that matter, among Sikhs and Jains in Queens, too. This is a story of faith, not of Joseph Smith's faith, unquote, right? So it's really interesting now that Mormonism now, he's talking about Mormonism as just fitting into these larger patterns of American religious history, right? It's become part of the American religious landscape, part of that sort of normalized American religious landscape, according to him. I would add that I do think that what I've called the anti-Catholic template remains in critiques of the Mormon Church as an institution. As I noted at the beginning, I think there's still, in the media, suspicion of the institution, especially depicted as a money-generating corporation that exploits its members' devotion and beliefs to fill its coffers. So it's still going on there. But I wonder if the way Mormon women are depicted in the media today, and this is in a more personalized and nuanced way than previously, indicates that LDS church members have reached a point where they can live and talk about their distinctive faith in ways that the media finds familiar and compelling. If there is indeed a change in how the media depicts, if there has been a change, and you guys can agree or disagree with this, and if change remains, which open to debate also, I wonder how this change will impact the experience of LDS women and men within their churches and communities, and within wider U.S. culture. What does a sense of difference and separateness add to the experiences of being an LDS woman or a man? And what might a growing sense of connection with wider U.S. culture add or subtract? So I leave those questions for you guys, and would be really interested to hear what you guys think.
I kind of went the rounds about what to talk about today. And Boyd had suggested that I talk about my own work and research and try to dovetail that with our theme a little bit for today. So I finally decided that the problem was that I had too much to say and not that I didn't have enough. So that's always my problem anyway. And I've tried to boil things down a little bit here, but I do want to talk about some of my own work. And then I basically, mostly as Suzanne has done, want to pose some questions for our discussion as we proceed today. So the first part I call Genderation in the Young Woman's Journal in 1890s Mormondom. And this is what I've been working on in my research. So we are certainly undergoing radical changes in our temporal and more especially our political affairs, observed Susie Young Gates in an 1891 editorial in the Young Woman's Journal. This was her monthly magazine that served as the organ of the Young Ladies Mutual Improvement Associations. And my work examines how those radical changes registered in the Young Woman's Journal in the decade of the 1890s, which was the era of the manifesto, statehood, and extensive dismantling of Mormonism's founding political and economic ideals. Now, in the journal, these pressures registered along generational lines, and that's why I get the gender and generation conflated here a little bit. Mormon women of a particular generation projected their fears and uncertainties onto their daughters with their discussions of spirituality, marriage, and materialism, the three primary areas in which young women were presumed to be troubled, serving as shorthand for larger fears about the future of the community and the meaning of Mormon identity. Now, this generation of young people in the 1890s was very large in absolute numbers. But it was also an important pivot point for the community because it was in this decade that previous patterns gave way and more members were added by birth than by conversion. And this was a pattern that would then hold for the next 60 years. So this meant that it was not solely external pressures that were forcing change in the community. And this is what the historiographical narrative has been all about. The Mormons as this distinctive people who are piled on by political and economic forces that then force them to change. But what I'm arguing is that there are internal dynamics going on in the community that are forcing some of these changes as well. Indeed, the very nature of what it meant to become a saint was shifting irrevocably. And of course, if we're going to talk about generations in the Young Woman's Journal, and in the 19th century generally, we do have to talk about gender as well. Women of Susie Young Gates' generation saw themselves as the primary agents of socialization and education for their daughters, the crucial mentors who would turn those young women into true Mormon women. And that is a term that they used, true women, all over the place. So it's not surprising that a magazine titled The Young Woman's Journal then would turn out to have the voices, perceptions, and concerns of mothers at its core. Generational concerns are always a matter of perception. Different generations live at the same time, writes sociologist Carl Mannheim in a classic study. But since experienced time is the only real time, they must all in fact be living in qualitatively quite different subjective eras. At any given moment in time, therefore, is a temporal volume having more than one dimension because it is always experienced by several generations at various stages of development. That's Mannheim's quote. To make sense of that moment, we must always sort out the individual voices of the various generations, each attaining that point in time in its own way. And the Young Woman's Journal is a very productive site for untangling and looking at the voices of the generations, sorting them out, I think we could say. Now, I find in the Young Woman's Journal a three-generation constellation, defined in terms of each generation's relationship to the definitive Mormon experience of crossing the plains and establishing the community in the West. And we couldn't get the slide to work, but I term these generations the pioneer, the frontier, and the railroad generations. And we can illustrate this through the family of Susie Young Gates. So Gates's parents, Lucy Bigelow and Brigham Young, belonged to the pioneer generation, those who had broken with the world to join the Mormon movement, crossing the plains, embracing plural marriage, enduring the hardships of frontier life in young adulthood to middle age. This had been the defining experience of these people's lives. In the 1890s, this generation was rapidly disappearing. Nonetheless, their example loomed large, and their voices were often heard recounting their experiences for the benefit of the younger people. Now, Gates herself belonged to what I call the frontier generation. This is the children of the pioneers whose Mormon identity was primary. They grew up in Mormon villages surrounded almost exclusively by other Mormons. For this generation, building the kingdom of God did not necessarily represent a radical break with a corrupt society that they had experienced firsthand. It was simply a fact of their everyday life. These children identified strongly with their parents, having been raised on dramatic retellings of mobbings and martyrdoms. Materially, they lived in an economy of scarcity, though with ever-increasing economic development. Many were children of polygamy, and all would have observed polygamy firsthand, at a time when it was practiced openly and with relatively little opposition. Many became polygamists themselves, and while it was always a difficult choice, in this generation it was perhaps experienced as more normal than at any other time. So entering the plural marriage was also for the frontier generation a way of laying claim to the same kind of soul-stretching sacrifices their elders had made. Now, Sousa's daughters, Leah Dunford and Emma Lucy Gates, were born in the 1870s and 80s, and they represent what I call the railroad generation, children who were born after the coming of the railroad and grew up amid the rapid changes that it brought. These young people, who were the assumed audience for the Young Woman's Journal, were like their parents, native-born Mormons. But in their early years, the distinguishing features of the community were increasingly under pressure. They never knew isolation and insularity to the same extent as their parents, and the trappings of consumer culture were increasingly available to them. Opportunity for education and cultural refinement, often obtained in the East, increased markedly. In many cases, their parents began to prosper, providing a level of material comfort and social opportunity previously unknown. Meanwhile, railroad children grew up in a time of intense disruption and uncertainty brought on by the federal anti-polygamy campaign, which Susanna has mentioned. Even those like Leah and Emma Lucy, whose parents were not polygamists, must have experienced a great deal of insecurity and turmoil in their youth, only to be told as they became teenagers and young adults that they were not measuring up to the sacrifices of their elders. Now, the dominant voice in the Young Woman's Journal was the frontier generation, the active midlife adults of the community during this period. Their parents, the frontier parents, were the increasingly elderly pioneers, and their children were the worrisome railroad generation. The frontier generation, Susie Young Gates and her co-workers, took on the role of mediators. They held up the stalwart example of their parents as a beacon to their children, attempting to hold the line against rapid social change. It's no coincidence, for example, that Susie Young Gates was one of the organizers of the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers. And this is the period when this narrative, this heroic narrative of Mormon pioneers that we still take largely for granted in the church, begins to really take shape and become ritualized. One item published in the Young Woman's Journal can serve as an illustration of this dynamic. It is a letter from Ruth Mae Fox, who signs herself just RMF, and published in April 1891. Now, Ruth Mae Fox was born in, I think, 1850, so she's this same generation as Susan. Sometimes we think we have a great deal to contend with, but I tell you, my sisters, when I read of the trials that our sisters passed through in early days, I feel ashamed that I thought I ever had a trial. And I think of the many blessings we enjoy at the present time in spite of persecution. Plenty to eat, plenty to wear, most of us in comfortable homes, and all of us surrounded by friends. What a contrast to the picture some of our aged sisters could draw. Many of them could tell us of no homes nor shelter in the dead of winter, no food, their children sick, a howling mob behind, a wilderness before, and as if this were not enough, many of their husbands were on missions or else in prison, and with all they had to contend with, what must have been a trial in those days, the doctrine of plural marriage. How could they have endured all this had it not been for their unbounded faith in God? Just think of it, and then think how grateful to our Heavenly Father we should be, and how we should love and respect those sisters that have set us such noble examples, and how we should endeavor to live so that we may be willing and able to endure anything and everything that our Father sees fit to sift us with. Now, conversations like these were also presented in fictional form, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to skip some here in the interest of time. But what we would have is stories titled something like Aunt Alice's Story, where the narrator literally is a member of this frontier generation And the story enacts a conversation between her and younger women, usually warning them off of marrying non-Mormon men and what will happen if they do. And that's a whole other topic that I had to cut out here. But the magazine then, the Young Woman's Journal, is fundamentally a conversation between generations. And as in the story, it's the older women who do most of the talking. The young woman's role is to listen, to internalize, and to affirm. And this is the project, both the goal and the method of the Young Woman's Journal. Okay, so what else can we say then based on this? What I've settled on is a loose series of observations and questions in the hope of spurring discussion rather than a tightly argued thesis, and I hope that will be okay. While I believe that generational dynamics as a lens for historical and cultural analysis can be overused, especially if that lens is employed reductively or deterministically, I also believe that those dynamics are a very real and often overlooked element of the picture. And I was actually thinking as our other two presenters were talking about some ways that generational issues might register with what they're doing. So this is my first question for you. What could we see about Mormon women and about the study of Mormon women if we looked generationally? And how might our answers to these questions be shaped by adding the element of postmodernism, which I will very loosely define here, as the resistance to authoritative narratives and the fundamental recognition of the complexity of human experience, both in individual and collective terms. We should acknowledge, of course, that the field of Mormon women's history and women's studies generally exists because of the rise of feminist theory and scholarship in the second wave of feminism in the United States in the 1960s and beyond. And of course, I'm making a big leap here from Mormon women and history to feminism, and I realize that we could talk all day about just feminism alone. We are now over 40 years past that watershed, and I am not by far the first to observe that feminism itself has become a generational phenomenon. Indeed, the intergenerational conflicts and discontinuities among feminists have been the subject of countless articles, books, conference presentations, and general laments. If you Google generational feminism, if you do, I don't know what you'll get. I got 4.2 million hits. So certainly we have a generational constellation in feminism today. I feel like I'm in something of a middle or mediator generation in that constellation, much like the frontier women of the 1890s. I'm old enough to have grown up in a world where the original goals and battles of the second wave feminists were being waged and were very much needed. I'm young enough to have benefited from many of their successes and to have been able to take for granted some of the things they fought for, while at the same time seeing younger women who don't seem to struggle in quite the same way I did or the older women did over fundamental questions about what is permissible and not. Ironically, I think one of the antidotes to all the angst produced by these concerns is to take a generational perspective. One generation's courageous act of rebellion becomes the next generation's baseline. Our feminist foremothers had to fight hard for things that we now take for granted, and that experience was real, but so is ours, and so is yours as younger women. So what about in Mormonism broadly defined? What does the generational constellation look like among Mormon women today? Are there defining events or moments from which we could identify differing generational responses? How has being a, quote, Mormon woman changed generationally? I pose these questions with no intention of offering any definitive answers at the moment, but I would love to hear everyone's ideas. Now, if we're going to talk about women in the LDS Church, I'm inclined to tell you about the women I know. The ward I am in right now is a very difficult place, or I should say it is populated by people who live very difficult lives. I would estimate that there are more people below the poverty line than above it. This is a place that struggles even in boom times, so you can imagine what the crash has meant. There are multiple families who are entirely dependent on the church. And even in some of the seemingly more stable households, there are a significant number of men who seem to have trouble getting or staying employed, and women who are the primary earners in the family. These are not working women in the glamorous or liberated sense. These are women who have absolutely no choice. We have many, many school teachers in our ward. I can name at least 10 off the top of my head, and I know there are more. All women, all of them the primary or co-equal providers in the family. Other than the teachers, there are probably less than half a dozen women who have college degrees. I know that many of those teachers love what they do, but I also know that many of them would consider it a big step up if they could quit working altogether. There are virtually no lessons or discussions in our Relief Society of whether women ought to work, and little glorification of marriage and motherhood as the only things women will do in life. As I have served in the Relief Society presidency for the past 2.5 years, we have tried to be very sensitive to the widely varying circumstances in which our sisters live. Young Women's is another story. I served in that organization for the first couple of years we were in the ward, and it never ceased to amaze me how virtually any topic could be turned into a lesson on temple marriage as the ultimate goal and apparently final destination of every girl in the room. In spite of the fact that those girls saw and lived every day with the absolute fact that their mothers work, mostly in low-wage, unskilled, dead-end jobs, there was no discussion about how those girls could improve their own prospects. It was still set up as a choice, and young women received the message, probably unintentional but real nonetheless, that it was an either-or decision, career or marriage, work or motherhood. It was an utter disconnect. But it's not new. Sousa ran a series in the Young Women's Journal in 1892 entitled Professional and Business Opportunities for Women, in which she purported to advocate education and career paths for young women. She profiled, more or less in this order, we might even say descending order, doctor and lawyer, stenographer and typewriter, photograph retouching, dentistry, and merchandising. There is a notable failure of imagination here that serves primarily to highlight the lack of viable ways for women to make a living in the 19th century. But then, as now, intergenerational mentoring made all the difference. Sousa's daughters became, respectively, a well-educated domestic scientist and a European-trained professional opera singer and music teacher. But they had support from their parents and other relatives and social connections who helped them see the possibilities that were available and work toward them. I think here of the young woman in my ward who, when I asked her what she wanted to do, said she would like to be an orthodontist or a veterinarian. Two admittedly lofty goals. But she was a good student and certainly could have gone on to college. Instead, she is now working assembly line at a scrapbooking company and apparently just biding her time until she finds a husband. Now, I don't know how typical the situation in my ward is. My sister has been Young Women's president in her ward across town from me for several years, and I know she has done much better than what I've seen in my ward. But she lives in an area that is more affluent and where it's likely that girls grow up with a broader sense of their own possibilities. And the thing is, I don't feel what I've observed in my ward reflects the rhetoric and counsel being given on a general level. There's been a great deal of emphasis in recent years on encouraging young women to get education. Now, usually, of course, it's framed in terms of in case you have to work, but even that is becoming less the case, and more emphasis on girls developing spirituality and personality for their own sake. So perhaps we are making progress generationally, but it seems uneven and highly contingent on factors other than what the official church is doing. As a mother of sons, I'd sure love to talk about messages being sent to young men as well. And I keep thinking as we're talking here, why is it that gender equals women? Why is that always the assumption and the discussion? And wouldn't we love to have some oral histories of Mormon men as well? Just a question. But not for you, Claudia. You have enough to do for the rest of your life. So, maybe after I get tenure, yes. These personal reflections are not as far separated from theoretical concerns as might appear, and here's where I'll reflect briefly on the postmodern aspect of the theme for today. To my mind, one of the most significant developments in feminist thinking has been the de-universalizing of the term woman, the recognition that women's lives and identities are and always have been shaped by multiple factors, and that gender all by itself is not a monolithic or even necessarily a unifying theme. The seeds of this recognition were present early in second-wave feminism. Indeed, they were there in the 19th and early 20th centuries as well, as we witness in controversies over admitting African-American women to suffrage organizations, or for that matter, the consternation of Eastern feminists when Mormon women showed up and wanted to claim membership and sisterhood with them. Since the triumphant narrative of the women's movement in both the first and second waves has been constructed largely by white middle-class Protestant women, it has taken some time to come to terms with the race and class-based assumptions that have driven critiques of patriarchy since the feminine mystique. And the question still remains, who is going to do the housework? Consider this quote from Romania B. Pratt, writing to Susie Young Gates about the remunerative prospects of starting a young women's magazine. It will pay you handsomely if well canvassed and enable you to hire all your wood cut and your water drawn and babies well tended by those not having the ability or wish to do greater things. Or this quote by Martha Hughes Cannon, another pioneer physician. "'Tis not the bringing of noble spirits into the world that dwarfs talent and retards woman's intellectual advancement, but it is the multiplicity of household drudgery which only belongs to servants." How many women in my ward, figuratively if not literally, clean houses, tend babies, or cook food so that other women can fulfill their potential? And now let me ask that question on a broader basis. How many of my sisters in the church work for 50 cents an hour sewing the fashionable clothes I wear to work, or assembling the cell phone, the laptop, the flash drives, upon which my supposedly prestigious professional accomplishments depend? This seems to me to be one of the issues that Mormon women are going to have to come to terms with in coming generations. All right, in closing, returning to the work of studying Mormon women's history, I also see generational implications. I see evidence that the current generation of scholars, with which I'm somewhat identified, are approaching their work in more complex and nuanced terms. We absolutely had to have and still need the pioneering work of Claudia and her generation, the work of recovery and recalibration of the fundamental narratives by which scholarship is done. I call this the compensatory model of women's studies. But while we are recognizing the complexities of coming to terms with that work, we are now recognizing the complexities of coming to terms with that work. For example, one of the consequences of the pioneering work has been the development of a narrative of Mormon women that focuses on a particular cadre of leading sisters, a particular group of relatively privileged Salt Lake-based polygamous wives. I have agitated against that conflation. Eliza R. Snow and her sisters were certainly Mormon women, and they are very much worthy of attention, but they were only one group of Mormon women, and we need to be careful about presenting their experience and their opinions as representative of the whole. So I think we have a way to go yet in uncoupling those two, and indeed in decentering our narratives of Mormon history from Salt Lake City, the institutional church, and the elite leaders who ran it. Claudia's project is a wonderful step in that direction. And to my mind, this is one of the most significant potentials of a postmodern approach to Mormon women.
Do you feel that from our generation to the last generation that more women are simply biding their time to get married, or that they're actually exploring their intellectual prowess and actually working in the career field that they want to, or that they're branching out?
I think it's an open question. I think certainly in many cases it's true, and I hope that perhaps we've raised the baseline on that a little bit. But I bring up the example in my own ward by way of pointing out the intersections between class and some of these other questions that has really been eye-opening to me as I've lived in this area, because I've kind of functioned in a world where people went to college and people had choices, and women thought in terms of their lives, at least somewhat related to feminist goals of doing something for themselves. And it's been very interesting to me to see how, at least anecdotally, class seems to really play into whether women are claiming that or not. So, good question. It's an open question.
Some of the Obama campaigners kind of made a slam towards Mitt Romney's wife being just a stay-at-home mom, and then Obama quickly pulled all of that back, saying, no, I don't support that statement. And it almost seemed to kind of shut off that area of the campaign. And I wondered if that was part of that, or if I've just kind of missed it not observing television.
A moment in the Mormon moment that, may point to maybe one of these factors why there's less focus on Mormon women. I'm curious to hear what other folks think. I would buy that may very well be part of a less of the focus on Mormon women. And I wonder if simply because the media is focused on Mitt Romney as an individual, and sort of what his faith journey is and his relationship to the church, that this may be also part of it. I'm really curious to see how this is going to play out as the campaign goes on. And he looks like he'll be the nominee, and we'll have more focus on his family and maybe his wife, for instance. She got a little airtime in the Olympics as well because she had a horse in the Olympics. So I'm curious what direction that will go in, actually.
I think Ann Romney is a very interesting case that we should look and watch because, of course, in 2008, she got what you might call a very bum rap because she came off as too privileged and too, she put people off instead of encouraging them in. And yet this time she seems to be very successful as a role model that people want to be like. Now, why is that the case, I think? Is that the changing world? Is that the Mormon moment, or is it her?
I have a husband who's 10 years older than me, and we talk about the gender and generational stuff all the time. He grew up in the era in the LDS Church when Mormons were a peculiar people. And I grew up in an era in the Mormon Church where we began to look for similarities, like the whole Mormon.org campaign. I found it interesting in both of your presentations that we're talking about that. You know, what is the Mormon moment and who is taking the lead in that, and whether it's the LGBTQ situation or whether it's the Mormon feminism or whether it's economic. I still believe that it is really a generational perspective. I know that even as I'm teaching my students here at UVU, my concerns are, of course, not my students' concerns as far as a Mormon woman. And my perceptions are most definitely not the same perceptions as theirs. And yet, how do you bridge that? All those generational gaps. I think that's maybe something that we saw, whether it was on Brian Williams last night or whether it was on the guy that interviewed Joanna Brooks, Jon Stewart, or whether it is Joanna Brooks representing us, or whether it's Mitt Romney representing us, or whether it's Laurel Ulrich representing us, and who is the us? I think it's very generational.
One of the things that you're saying is, well, what your comments generated for me was that when I'm thinking about how depictions, say, of Mormon women have changed in the media, it sounds like from what you're saying that part of that may be coming from the community itself, and how this new generation is interfacing with wider American culture in a different way, in a way that the media feels more comfortable with or seems more familiar to the media. I mean, is that sort of what you're thinking about?
How we want to portray and how that portrayal is received.
Yeah. Well, and you also bring up the point, this question of who represents us. I wonder if we've also reached a point in terms of media depiction where there's an acknowledgement that there's lots of different kinds of people in the LDS Church, and that all of these different folks who are kind of in the public eye is that they're representing that, and that also may be an indication of, again, a maybe more nuanced view of the community. I don't know. Yeah, I throw that out there.
I was really interested in last night's program with Brian Williams, so much so that I reviewed it and wrote exactly what he said. He stated, Mormons have lots of kids. Those kids grow up in a church where the two genders, male and female, are not equal. That is one tradition among many that has survived despite all the changes going on in the world outside of the church. How do we in scholarship change that perception? I mean, we can argue whether that is true or not true. For my own experience, that has not been true. What can I do as a Mormon scholar to change that perception of being a downtrodden woman? Especially here, I guess, in Utah Valley, in the state of Utah, where it seems to be where we're the most stereotypical kind of group of women.
I have the microphone, and I would like to pass it to somebody else. I mean, that's a great question. That one really stuck for me too when I saw that statement. I mean, this is one place where postmodern critique, I think, is really important, because what does equality mean? there's some fundamental assumptions there driving that kind of statement that I think need to be unpacked a little bit. And like you say, there's a lot of different ways of measuring that, and in some ways, and from some perspectives, it's going to look different than others. But you know, how I think as scholars and as people who lead discussion and shape discussion about these things, I think it's incumbent upon us to take a complex view and to foreground a complex view of some of these terms that get used reflexively in the discourse. And I want to know what other people have to say.
Well, I think it certainly is true. It is an unequal church in all sorts of ways. So what is the difference? So we see a lot of men taking action. We see a lot of women sitting down. What this means is that women should take action. Everybody can take action. Everybody can find an arena on which she can act within the church. And, you know, you don't have to have people agree with you to take action. I mean, you take action, you say things. One of the things I say, for instance, in churches, Bishop, when I see all these young men on the stand and doing various things, I don't get to know the girls. What can we do to get the girls up on the stand? Now, he may not agree with that. He may think that's a very bad thing to say, but it's in his mind from then on, you know, and pretty soon you see some girls doing one thing or another. We all have, I mean, we all know there are tremendously powerful, smart, savvy, capable women in the church. And we're all capable of running our own projects, doing whatever we want that will make a difference in our wards and in our communities. We just, instead of waiting for somebody to tell us what to do, we should just do it. All kinds of things.
Well, I have it. Let me just add one thing, which is that I think perceptions of equality may also be something that fall along generational lines as well. What does it mean? What does it mean to women of my generation or younger women coming up when you ask this question, are Mormon women equal? I think there may be some generational differences in how people would answer that as well.
But I would agree with what Lisa said. Just continue to talk about these issues in a nuanced way, and complicate the assumptions, complicate the stereotypes. And I think the project that Claudia is doing is a great way also of getting the voices of women in the scholarly discourse. And that's that's the first step. You guys all know this. The first step to having a nuanced discussion is getting the information out there, getting the voices out there. And so that sort of work seems really important to me, especially if we're talking about moving into the future. As Claudia was saying, this is a resource for people in the future to tap into and to have these more nuanced kinds of discussions. So I think it's great.
We give value to the things. You know, it's up to us to make those things different. We don't have to just reflect the values of others. We can give value to things.
What I'm getting from the seminars, I strongly feel that the opinions of individuals matter, and that throughout the history of the church, it seems like the opinions of Latter-day Saint women have really changed the church in good ways, in great ways. In your research, how have you seen the church change in terms of policy, or in terms of how the church is perceived because of the opinions of Latter-day Saint women? And in the future, how do you think the church will continue to change as the result of Latter-day Saint women?
In terms of the impact of LDS women on the church in the past, you know, there's a very long history of, Lisa touched on, a focus has been on sort of these elite women working in the Relief Society in the 19th century, and how they really were running their show. They were running their own show. And and oh, okay, sorry, you're gesturing at somebody else. Okay, and that you know, just one specific example is, or actually maybe two. Well, now I have three. The start of the primary association that was generated by Aurelia Spencer. The Young Women's organization was also, was that, what do you think about that?
That's attributed to Brigham Young.
Okay, so maybe not so much,
It's
maybe
a
I only
long
have two.
story. Yeah.
And then also the storing of grain in the 19th century was something that was generated from the side of the Relief Society. And I think that the focus on sort of storing and saving for the future continues into the present day church. So I think that there are a number of specific examples where you can see women really impacted the shape and the direction of the institutional church. Those are just two examples. I mean, I think you can make the argument that that goes on a level that has been going on a level that you can't quantify as well. And that's probably the most impactful level where women's concerns, women's lives, women's experiences shape the concerns of the church on the ward level and on up to the top. And in terms of the future, I don't know. What do you guys think? Genuinely, I'm interested to hear what you guys think about that.
The question I have, I guess all three of you should think or could answer. What I encounter in teaching critical theory at UVU is a kind of, I want to call it a generational backlash toward feminism. And I think here in Utah Valley especially, the F word is actually feminism. There's a real threat there, and as I've thought about that, it's actually, my perception is that women are often, young women are often more threatened by that discussion than men are in my classes. And so I'm wondering how we deal with this in the church. I think maybe part of that is going back to our history. I mean, I think our you know, those pioneer, what did you call them, pioneers and the frontier saints would be really appalled that we've got such a negative attitude toward feminism as Mormons. And so I'm wondering how we kind of deal with that, and how we, and maybe part of what you're experiencing in your ward, Lisa, is this kind of threat of choices that young women face.
Feminism has had a very negative definition in the church as well, church leadership as well as ward leadership and so on. You know, it is a very scary and threatening term. But of course, let's define it in a way that's useful. And for me, that useful way is feminism is encouraging the talents and abilities of all the women in the community for the benefit of themselves, their institutions, the church, the community, for themselves, their families, the church, the community. Yes, for all those things. And that's all feminism means to me, is instead of sitting on your abilities, you do something with them. You develop them. You contribute to your society. And so I don't find it, of course, threatening, because I'm a feminist from way back. But, you know, let's just redefine these words that upset us. Certainly we do not want to have the perception that we have in the United States that the women are oppressed and badly treated. They're only oppressed if they want to be. I mean, they have certainly a great many choices. They can do things. Certainly we have feminists in the church the way they've been defined by me and the way they used to be defined. We just are people that do things. Now, there are many problems about making changes because we have a very patriarchal structure. But all of us have, as I have said before, arenas in which we act. We have positions, we have friends, we have groups, and we can do endless things in those groups. That's difficult because, of course, It's very hard to change the institutional structure, and I'm not sure we want to bother to try that. But the problem with that is that there's no memory. You can do a wonderful thing, and then it will be forgotten. So here is the final word. If women want to be remembered, if they want to do significant things, they have to write. They have to write something. They have to write history. They have to write their opinions. They have to get their biographies down. Writing is what lasts. You know, institutions change. You get it on the bookshelf, it's there.
What Claudia says is true. We can reshape and redefine it, but feminism is an intertextual word, shall we say. It's something that our students are going to come to us, or our neighbors, our ward members, our family, anybody where we use that term, it comes with baggage. It comes with meanings and resonances that are already existent. And so, yes, we can very much be upfront with how we define and use the term. And when we're talking about teaching and employing terms in a scholarly framework, we have more of an ability to do that, to foreground, to upfront, to make it a conscious matter of discussion, to unpack the term a little bit with our students. There may be other settings where we have to decide and be more deliberate about what terms we use and how we use them, just because we may not have that luxury, that time of unpacking. I don't know. I think it's something that we go the rounds with. Those of us who identify as feminist scholars. Yeah, okay, keep going.
My thought is that one really important aspect, not to repeat over again, is to get women's stories into historical narratives so that we can have a nuanced discussion about how gender roles have evolved, where we're at, where we're going, and be able to contextualize that within the larger historical what's been going on. So again, I just think the recording, interpreting, talking about women's and men's experiences is just what's one aspect to this, I guess I would say.
I had a friend who, a lot of times people know that a ward will have shut-ins or people who are unable to make it to church, and they will send the Aaronic priesthood boys over with the sacrament to administer the sacrament to them. And when she was growing up, the bishop made a very strong point of sending the young women from ages 12 to 16 or 18, as well as the boys that would give the sacrament. He would send a chorus of girls with them, and they would sing a sacrament song for the shut-ins, and then they would administer the sacrament. And then he took that further to the point where the sacrament hymn in church was sung by the young women. And so he would have one little choir of girls and one, the quorum of the boys that would do the administration of the sacrament. And she felt like she never was left out of that. Most, the emphasis being on, the message always that sacrament meeting is the sacrament is the most important thing of that meeting, more than the sermons. And so she never felt as left out by the priesthood restriction. That actually caught up with her when she had a baby, and then she became quite adamantly feminist. But there are institutional ways, and I appreciate Claudia's making the distinction between the individual decision to stay oppressed or within an oppressive situation rather than the decision to say, well, I'm not going to take this, I'm going to record it and tell people, and I'm going to put it on the bookshelf, as opposed to the institution, which moves with glacial speed sometimes about the changes that it might need to make. But it's interesting to me that there was one example of a bit of a crossover, maybe a bridge, where that one bishop made the decision to include the girls as well as the boys, rather than sort of men-women thing. He started it in the youth, and that gave my friend a little bit more sanctuary as a teenager than she might have had otherwise.
That's explicitly not in the handbook, so it's very interesting that a bishop would do that. Can I just put one pitch in here really quick, and I'm going to pass this off to Claudia. There's a very important article in the Journal of Mormon History last year by Catherine Brekus, Catherine Brekus, and it's a discussion of Mormon women and agency. And she's arguing that we need to take a more nuanced look at the issue of Mormon women and agency, and be careful about throwing terms around like oppression and inequality and those kinds of things, but to take a very complicated view. I think it's the spring 2011 issue of the Journal of Mormon History, and in my estimation, it's one of the most important articles that's come out in Mormon women's history in quite some time.
Certainly a lot of the personality and interests of the bishop make such a big difference in this, that a bishop can shape his congregation to be much more friendly toward women than otherwise. A friend of mine held her baby this last month when her husband blessed it. They tried a number of variations. They said, how about if we do this? How about if I hold the microphone? How about how can I be involved in this operation? And the bishop finally decided, well, I think you should hold the baby, and then the priesthood will bless the baby. Now that's mind-boggling from various groups I've been in, but it isn't against the rules. Doesn't say that anywhere. I would say also along this line that for several years my sisters and I prepared the sacrament every week. That is, we filled the bottles, put out the table, and we did all these things. We had no young men around that would do it. My father was the bishop. He said, you do it. And we did that until a returned missionary came home and called the ward to repentance for this terrible breach of awful things that should never have occurred. But I just want to say that we often have some movement, and why not be imaginative in what we do. This business about agency. Agency is the issue. Agency is the issue. Women have free agency, not only to decide between this and that, but to decide which things to decide between. That's very important.
Your story reminded me of what Lisa was talking about in terms of how we do history as scholars. Look not just at the elite, look not just at the central leadership, but also at the more grassroots local levels, where there's a lot of stuff going on that's really hard to track. But it's really important to track, and that's when you can sort of get to the question that was asked down here, I think a little bit about how women and other members of the church, other groups within the church, have impacted the church, is following that, taking that sort of level of institutional existence or grassroots existence seriously.
Is there kind of a separate sphere of Mormon scholarship and general membership? And can they actually, are we at a point in general membership terms where we can start infusing a lot of this scholarship in there? And I think the way that you've answered that a lot is just by everyday action, as a Sunday school teacher, how do you speak about things? As a Relief Society teacher, how do you speak about things? If you're in ward council, what do you suggest to the bishop? Things like that, that may be informed by scholarship for those of us who think in those terms. And I say that because I'm a young woman president in my ward, and so I've tried to actively kind of move away from some practices that I didn't think were helpful, and that was informed by my thinking in the academic world. But the general membership, who to a certain extent feels threatened sometimes by real heavy-duty scholarship, for instance, let's define feminism in Relief Society. How would that go over, Would that go over? Are we at a point? And I would say the younger generation is absolutely ready for that. Absolutely. I would have no problem bringing that up in young women and saying, this is what feminism is, and talking about it with them. But would I be able to do that in Relief Society? It goes back to the generational thing. And is the answer then just the action that is informed by the scholarship, or do we need to bring in an overt way kind of the more complex and nuanced ways of looking at ourselves as LDS in official activities in the church?
No matter what it means to me, if I stand up in Relief Society and say feminism, the rest of the day is going to have to be about explaining what I mean. And we're not going to get to what the point that I wanted to make. And so, but I will say this. I do know and have several good friends, and okay, let me preface this. It's an especially interesting question to consider in the LDS Church, which is such a hierarchical, which there is this hierarchical structure to. Because it does bring up that question of whether things can change only at the bottom, or at what point does the top have to get involved? At what point do things have to happen from the top down as opposed to just the bottom up? But I can tell you that I have we all do have several good friends who are working in the church history department, who are working in the institutional organization that constructs and disseminates history to church members generally, who are very much invested and engaged in exactly this, in bringing the best of scholarly perspectives and nuanced interpretations to bear on the narrative of church history that makes its way into manuals, lessons, ensigns, and things like that. So again, that's going to take us back to generational things. But I think over the coming decades, as the result of things like the Joseph Smith Papers Project, that's going to insert a whole new level of this into the official discourse and official awareness in the church. What people do with that, again, is going to be, I think, highly variable. But I think there's reason to be hopeful and very optimistic about what's happening right now institutionally in terms of coming to terms with church history, Mormon history.
For living a broader, expansive life in the church, they can find it in D&C 25, which is the revelation to Emma Smith. It says all the things we know about doing a hymn book, being a comfort to her husband, which we all know is very important, also about being a scribe and so on. But it says very explicitly, and it says that this is to all, it says that she should exhort the congregation, expound the scriptures, says thy time shall be given to learning and writing much. You just don't need any more justification than that to do endless numbers of things.
I really liked your definition, your loose definition of what we mean when we say postmodern. Another important distinction that I understand and continue to approach in complex and difficult ways in my classroom when I teach this kind of material, especially in relation to gender, is sort of a fundamental binary between essentialism and constructivism. We're deeply, absolutely made. There are natural distinctions between men and women, for example. There are things that make us truly and authentically women, and as such, of course, feminism is an interesting conservative category, which is, I think, part of the difficult discussions that we have in a place like this. And I was thinking of that when I heard Claudia talking about the different kinds of women and the requirement that, of course, first they be women in order to be included in this project. It occurred to me, for example, I've been thinking and writing about a transgendered cousin of mine who probably wishes for nothing more than to be a sort of pleasant, frumpy Relief Society counselor, and can't be that. And I almost wondered in a certain way if we could include her and her feminine forms in discussions of Mormon femininity and interviews of femininity. But it illustrates for me a very, very difficult question in a forum like this, and that is, if we embrace any of the principles of postmodernism as a constructivist, that we make things when we name them. I think one of our questions has to be, wherever we stand in our relationship to the Mormon Church, certainly where we stand on issues of gender, what do we make when we insist on these distinctions? What do we mean when we make these distinctions? And how do we take responsibility for what we create? And I'm haunted by this, of course, in all of my teaching and certainly in my parenting, when we accept, no matter how nuanced, these clear distinctions between male and female. And it does make me wonder if the United States isn't revealing a lot of its sort of uncanny conservatism by returning and looking at Mormonism, and now refusing, or not so much looking at questions of Mormon femininity, if we aren't in a certain way returning back to a need to affirm essential distinctions that have been under question with postmodern thinking for quite a while now.
You know, I don't know that I can add much to that, Karen, because it's a really important point. It gets back to my little aside about this question of why, when we talk about gender, it has to be women. Why? What is the construction of Mormon maleness? That seems to me to be almost a completely unplowed field that ought to be considered a little bit more. And I know, Susanna, in your work, you've done quite a bit with collaborative at lived experience in religion. You know, somebody dreams and someone interprets, or someone speaks in tongues and someone interprets, and sometimes that's a gendered thing and sometimes it's not. Healing rituals that used to be more collaborative between the genders. So, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, it's worth a lot of thought and consideration. I wish I could say it more profoundly, or say more, or speak more profoundly to that.
One of the reasons why we focus on women when we talk about gender, it goes back to this idea that I brought up in my presentation, that as a culture, U.S. Mormon, you know, across the board in the United States, that there is a real focus on women as being the bedrock of sort of stability of society and of the family. And therefore, when we go through difficult times or when we have questions, that's when we focus on women. That's why we focus on women, I think, because there's so much, and I wonder if it's, a lot of it is unconscious sort of anxiety around women and what they do, and if they're going to, you know, sort of bring down society, bring down the family. I wonder if it goes back to these really deeply held cultural assumptions about women's roles in culture, just across the board.
General anxieties that get projected onto women, that the focusing on women reflects larger anxieties that then gets projected onto women, and those anxieties may or may not really, you know, we may or may not deserve that as women. It may not be the whole story. This whole question of essentialism. Those of you who are LDS or have studied LDS culture know about the Proclamation on the Family, and it uses that word essential in that proclamation. And I've often wished that I could go talk to the people who wrote that and ask them how consciously that was employed, and do we understand the realms of the generations of debate that have gone on behind that question, and what does that really mean? For me, it raises more questions than it answers. But I think members of the church on a lay level tend to accept that pretty uncomplicatedly. And how much we can do to complicate that and bring more nuance into it, I'm not sure. Again, thinking in terms of men, what do we do with our young men who are perceived to be more effeminate, to use an outdated term? You know, how, or our girls that are termed to to be seen as more masculine. It seems like there's an opportunity to explore and address some of these issues, again, generationally, as we look at the young people and the way that we talk to and about them.
Claudia, if you don't mind, and then if Lisa and Susanna would like to jump in, excellent. There's been several references to hierarchy and the patriarchal nature of the church. There's been no reference to priesthood up to this point. I'm interested in the interviews that you've, the histories that you've conducted. How did women frame up the concept of priesthood in their world? In my experience, it's very, very muddy water for women. There's no distinction between power in priesthood and ordination. If you're not ordained, you don't access priesthood. And to me, that split is incredibly problematic. So I'm interested to know if women regionally mention priesthood. Did they lean wholly on ordination? Were there women out there in different places that understood the concept of ordination and power, which a woman can enjoy all the power of the priesthood, right? Can you speak to that? And then if the other panelists would like to address that, I would be fascinated to know.
Of course, you must know that, of course, in our interviews, we have everything. We have women that are very supportive of the situation. We have women that are very critical of it. And we have women who feel that they cannot, in good terms, in good conscience, remain in the church when there is so much more power on the male side, and they do feel it as power. But you know, there are plenty of others who make peace with it, because they see many of them who are married to authority, as I have certainly been for many years, know that the situation is just not anywhere near as clear or as easy as it would seem to be for the boss. You know, so you just have to realize that the power and the priesthood carry heavy burdens as well as opportunities and so on. But, you know, this is a split that people often see between women who identify themselves with the F word and those who do not. That those who have the F word do tend to see it as more oppressive. The others see it as a service organization that they can be in, that they don't want because they don't need another responsibility to take on, that sort of thing. So you have a very broad range. I would say most interesting in the interviews are the times when people come up against not their husbands, but against the bishop or the stake president. Many cases where women feel they have been misunderstood and mistreated by ward leadership. You know, that is a position where you have someone in a potentially powerful position over you. And some of them are put down terribly by that. Others say, I just realized that he was just another person and didn't know any better than I did, and I just went my way and did my thing, and so on. So you have a tremendously wide range. I wanted to say something about, well, I had another few comments in mind, which I've lost, which is what I do. But I think that women in the church do not exercise nearly the amount of power that they could, the amount of power and authority. They wait to be told to do things. They don't have to do that. They should exercise power in themselves. You say that women can exercise priesthood authority, but that's only through marriage. Is that not correct? No. There are single women in the church do not feel that they exercise any priesthood authority.
It's in the scriptures, as you indicate. You've got Emma being given the green light to do a variety of powerful things. And then in the history of the Relief Society, which has just been distributed to the entire church, boy, when that book is opened up, you see that sisters were utilizing, not through ordination, but through power, the power of the priesthood through blessings and things like that, that the power is accessible to equally to both men and women. Ordination's a different question, and that fits into the patriarchy.
Would it be fair to say that the recent fairly major reorganization of the church that we see in correlation has emphasized the distance that women have from the priesthood rather than encouraging it, and that this is not necessarily the situation that will be carried on in heaven or in ideal earth? Is that fair to say? Can that be seen as a worldly rather than a religious or divine development? If so, that explains a great deal, I think.